The old city's underbelly had always beckoned those drawn to mystery. Crumbling cobblestone paths above hinted at secrets below, but few had the courage to descend. Allegedly, a labyrinth sprawled beneath the streets, thick with the city's unspoken shame and suppressed memories. In the quiet hours before dawn, the place became a legend, repeated in hushed whispers. A subterranean corridor stretching toward a long-abandoned asylum, said to house the city's regret. Whether it was truth or rumor, people sensed that something malignant lurked down there. Brielle Sorensen never planned to investigate the labyrinth. A research assistant at the local museum, she had spent her days poring over dusty archives, content to catalog other people's histories. But that fragile balance shattered when she uncovered a curious map. Yellowed with age and spotted with water damage, it showed a labyrinth that branched out from beneath the museum itself. On the lower corner, a mark indicated an unholy structure labeled Penrose Asylum. Brielle could scarcely believe her eyes. Everyone said the old asylum had been sealed shut long ago, its existence quietly erased. Yet here it was, mapped out on a forgotten piece of parchment. At first she told herself it was just the product of an overactive imagination and a misreading of the faint script, but the deeper she looked, the more evidence she found in the archives to corroborate the labyrinth's presence. Ancient city plans linked hidden tunnels to the building that once served as Penrose Asylum. According to old court records, the city had constructed the asylum in the 1800s to confine the mentally ill and bury unfortunate truths. Stories of experimentation, of patients' regrets made tangible, circulated for decades like a stench that refused to dissipate. Though she felt a vibrant flicker of apprehension, Brielle was compelled to find the labyrinth's entrance. After all, she rationalized, if this place indeed existed, it would be a remarkable historical find. Maybe her name could be tied to the discovery. It was research, she told herself. Her nights grew restless as her thoughts returned to the labyrinth. She dreamed of a corridor lit by flickering torches, the walls breathing, the ground pulsing with subdued life. She would jerk awake with the distinct sensation that something was calling to her from underground. Eventually, she trudged back into the museum after hours, her heart pounding, determined to test the passages for herself. Slipping past security was easier than she expected. A few well-chosen words and a convincing story about needing additional time for artifact preservation got her inside. The museum's basement sprawled with crates and half-opened boxes of exhibits, the air thick with dust motes dancing in the half-lit gloom. The neon glow of exit signs bleached the corridors an unsettling green. She clutched the ancient map in her trembling hand, following it step by step until she spotted a rough seam in the floor beneath a supply closet. She pried open what looked like a metal access hatch. There it was, an old stone staircase spiraling down into blackness. The air that rose from below was stale and bitter. Fear twisted in her gut, but so did an undeniable curiosity. She inhaled, took a shaky step onto the stairs, and carefully pulled the hatch shut above her. The suffocating quiet enveloped her as she descended with a flashlight, heart thumping in her throat. Each step creaked as if complaining at her reckless intrusion. At the bottom of the winding stairs, she entered a narrow corridor lined with rough-hewn stone. Archways branched off unpredictably, forming what might have once been support structures. Her flashlight revealed disturbing details. Cryptic symbols scratched into the walls, and scraps of discarded fabric strewn along the floor as if people had torn at their clothing in terror. The air smelled of mold, rot, and something unsettlingly sweet. The stale atmosphere closed in around her, but she pressed forward, the labyrinth beckoning. As she walked, her mind conjured fleeting shadows at the edges of her vision. Hushed voices seemed to whisper from just around the corner. She whirled the flashlight to confront her illusions, but saw nothing aside from her own shadow set dancing against the stone. Deeper and deeper she went. Sometimes she nearly turned back, panic coiling in her stomach, but the path always drew her forward with small signposts, an arrow carved into a slab of rock, a bit of furniture that might have once been part of a waiting room. It was as though someone, or something, wanted her to keep going. Hours passed in a haze of dread-laced tension. Her knees shook, and her lungs felt short of breath, yet she persisted. Eventually she stumbled upon a wide corridor that opened into a great chamber. The flashlight's beam revealed doors, dozens of them lining the walls in neat rows. She swept the light across their surfaces. Intricate iron bars, broken handles, a few set ajar. Quiet thundered in her ears, broken only by the muffled drip of water somewhere. Tentatively she crossed the threshold and pressed on one of the doors. It swung open with a tortured groan. Inside she saw what looked like a holding cell. A single cot stood in the corner, its mattress a decaying slab of fabric. The walls bore scratch marks forming incoherent messages. Brielle shuddered. This place had to be Penrose Asylum. She had found it, found the beating heart of the city's darkest rumors. Driven by a mix of morbid curiosity and a sense of professional duty, Brielle ventured farther through the corridor. She explored more cells, equally barren, yet brimming with echoes of unimaginable pain. Some contained small wooden chests or steel boxes with their locks smashed open. Others had only the tatters of straitjackets on the floor. The deeper she went, the more she felt the walls humming. At times the vibration crawled along her skin and burrowed into her thoughts, stirring her own regrets to the surface. Memories of her younger brother's funeral, the last words they'd exchanged, the guilt she had carried ever since, flashed through her mind uninvited. By the time she reached the center of the asylum's labyrinthine halls, her vision felt hazy. Doors seemed to shift on their hinges, corridors looping back onto themselves in a dizzying puzzle. She realized she might be walking in circles. A series of flickering fluorescent lights, power sources unknown, illuminated a hallway that beckoned to her like a cursed invitation. She hesitated, her heart rattling her rib cage, then proceeded in. The corridor was lined with large glass panels on one side, as if once used for observation of patients. The glass, though cracked, reflected her features in a warped, elongated manner. Through them she saw glimpses of rooms that resembled therapy stations. Old chairs with leather straps, tables scattered with rusted instruments. Everything reeked of a stale, bitter memory. As she walked, she heard faint echoes of sobbing, or perhaps mania-filled laughter carried on a dreadful wind. She felt an inner quake, like her body recognized an unspeakable truth. Then came the voices. At first she thought it was just the rustle of her jacket echoing in the hollow chambers, but they grew louder, voices calling her name, urging her onward. She tried to rally her rational mind, telling herself it was just her imagination fed by fear. Yet the labyrinth felt alive. She caught glimpses of movement in the corner of her eye, flickers of shapes that vanished the moment she turned her head. Shortly after, she reached a door marked with the words, "Director's Office." The letters were chipped and faded but discernible. She pushed open the door, finding a once grand space. Torn draperies hung from the windows. The desk, an impressive relic of polished oak, bore the weight of shadows and decay. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and a single folder rested at the desk's center. Brielle moved closer, her fingers trembling as she flipped it open. The folder contained patient files, some with photos stapled to the pages. A flickering overhead light revealed a litany of heartbreak, patients deemed moral deviance, melancholic lunacy, recurrent night terrors. But one file took her breath away. The photograph was so faded as to be nearly invisible. The name typed in crumbling letters, Ellis Sorensen. She stared at it, blood pounding. Her family name. Slowly she turned the pages, scanning the text. According to the record, Ellis Sorensen had been committed to Penrose Asylum in 1910 after murdering a family member. Rage flared in his eyes, the small black and white photograph capturing a still moment of anguish. Brielle's mind reeled. Her father had once mentioned an ancestor who'd been institutionalized, but the details were murky. The knowledge that the hallway she now stood in had once contained her own flesh and blood felt like a coil wrapping around her heart in a vise grip. Before she could register the depth of this discovery, a thunderous clang resounded from somewhere deeper in the asylum. She dropped the file and spun around, pressing herself to the desk, breath hitching in her chest. The clang repeated, echoing as if a massive door was being forced open. Gathering her courage, she left the office and followed the noise. Her steps slowed as she advanced down a sloping corridor leading to a sublevel. A battered metal door hung ajar at the bottom. Light flickered in sporadic bursts behind it. Inside, she found a long ward of padded rooms. The overhead fixtures, improbably still operational, bathed the area in a flickering, jaundiced light. Doors to the padded cells stood open, revealing sealed spaces lined with stained, peeling padding. Her footfalls felt impossibly loud. The clang resounded again, closer. She followed the source until she finally saw it, a hulking figure in a corner, slamming its body against the bars of a cell door. She froze in absolute terror. The figure seemed half real, clad in rags that might have once been a hospital gown. Its face was partially obscured, but she caught the glint of furious eyes. She raised her flashlight, shining it onto the figure's ashen features. It let out a rasp so guttural that she almost dropped the beam. For an instant their gazes locked, and she was overcome by a dreadful certainty. This was not just a restless spirit or a figment of some twisted imagination. It had weight. It was real in some bitter, horrifying way. With mounting panic, she tried to back away, but the figure lunged. She heard metal fling open in a shower of sparks. All she could do was run. The labyrinth turned into a chaotic maze of corridors and intersecting passageways, the overhead lights dimming and dying in sequence, as though guiding her deeper and deeper. Her heart hammered so violently that she wondered if it might burst. She came upon a small lounge area, chairs overturned, a vending machine that must have been installed decades ago. The glass cracked. Footsteps pounded behind her. She dove behind a counter, pressing her hand against her mouth to stifle her ragged breathing. The footsteps passed, the irregular scraping of them making her skin crawl. Silence enveloped her again, but she was certain the figure hadn't gone far. It was stalking her, she realized, along the twisted halls of a place that no longer obeyed conventional logic. Cautiously, she slipped out another corridor, glancing behind her every few steps. She needed to find an exit, or at least a vantage point to get her bearings. The labyrinth's architecture seemed only to tighten around her like a fist. Her flashlight beam caught ephemeral graffiti. "You have regrets," a swirl of shapes that resembled faces in agony. Then she saw the message scrawled in thick black paint on the wall. "Nothing leaves, nothing forgotten." She pressed on, her anxiety clawing at her sanity. The spectral voices returned, echoing her own regrets, her failings and shame taunting her. Her subconscious mind conjured mocking silhouettes of her younger brother, the disappointment in his adolescent eyes. She recalled the promise she'd broken, the last dispute they had. Guilt slammed into her like a crashing wave. She gripped her head, reeling, struggling to maintain her grip on reality. Eventually, she found a room that looked like a small chapel. Fragmented stained glass windows allowed watery glimmers of light to seep through from somewhere behind the walls. Rows of pews stood rotting under a collapsed ceiling. At the front was a lectern, its surface carved with archaic symbols and layered in dust. Something compelled her to move forward. Possibly it was the faint notion that this chapel might contain an exit or a clue. She approached the lectern. Lying atop it was a thick ledger, its pages moldy but intact. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Names, thousands of them, scrawled across the parchment. Handwritten confessions, or maybe final statements, from those who had once been lost here. The pages gave off a sour odor of damp decay mingled with despair, and she heard the whisper of voices threading through her mind. "Help me, I can't escape." Brielle turned the page slowly and recoiled at a line of text that seemed specifically addressed to her. "Advance, and your recreates become your reality." She slammed the ledger shut, her breath ragged, tears spilling down her cheeks. A thunderous crash from the corridor made her stiffen. That monstrous figure was still roaming, but now the footsteps sounded like many. Did the labyrinth hold an entire legion of lost souls? She scrambled to the far side of the chapel and found a narrow corridor behind a broken panel. Crouching low, she squeezed through, stifling a sob as she recognized a faint sliver of moonlight at the end. She moved forward with renewed hope. Perhaps there was a passage leading above ground, but as she emerged from the cramped corridor, her stomach twisted into knots. She was back in the stone tunnels that preceded the asylum's entrance. But the path seemed different, narrower, the walls closer, the ground slick with water, or something thicker. She hurried on, guided by the ephemeral glow. Each step was a fresh ordeal, the muddy ground threatening to pull her under. The walls felt like they were breathing again, exhaling a malevolent wind that carried disembodied murmurs. She thought she could hear her own voice crying out from some distant vantage, though her lips were clamped shut. Time lost all meaning. Her flashlight flickered and died, forcing her to feel her way against damp, rough walls. She took slow, deliberate steps, her hands scraping the stone. Occasionally she heard a skittering noise, like rats or worse. Her skin warmed with the memory of the monstrous figure, frightening and relentless. The labyrinth, she now understood, was designed to feed on insecurities, to drag up regrets until reality warped around them. In the darkness, her mind wandered to her younger brother, the day of his accident, and her sense of responsibility. She had been the older sibling. Shouldn't she have protected him? Would things have been different if she had taken 5 minutes to talk instead of letting their argument linger? The memory consumed her, magnified in these subterranean depths. She felt tears burn down her cheeks, hot and smothering. The labyrinth pressed inward, as if tasting her sorrow. Then, out of the blackness, she sensed a new presence. A light bobbed ahead. Terrified, Brielle froze. But the light remained motionless for a moment, then advanced slowly. She heard a voice, close to a whisper. "Hello?" The tone was tentative, fragile. A beam of light cut across her face and she flinched, blinking rapidly. Standing a few yards away was a man in dusty clothes, a miner's helmet strapped to his head. He looked as if he'd been roaming this underground complex for days. "Are you real?" he asked, stepping closer. His eyes flickered with a desperate glimmer that made her heartbeat jump. She whispered back that yes, she thought so. A wave of relief washed over his features, and he introduced himself as Aaron. He'd been exploring the labyrinth for weeks, or so he claimed, though his sense of time was hopelessly skewed. He offered to guide Brielle out. He claimed to have seen glimpses of the city's sewer system near the outskirts of the labyrinth, though he had yet to find a sure path. With no time to waste, they joined forces. Their small orbs of light wove through the dripping tunnels. Aaron explained how he had become trapped after wandering in with a group of urban explorers. One by one, they were separated by illusions. He had found reminders of personal regrets, old heartbreaks, unfinished business, manifesting in unexplainable ways. He talked about how it still haunted him, hearing his mother's voice, seeing the scornful face of someone he'd once betrayed. Brielle nodded, traded stories in hushed tones, her chest raw with empathy. Regrets seemed to form the labyrinth's lifeblood, fueling its illusions and horrors. She wondered if that monstrous figure was a living embodiment of someone's darkest remorse, turned feral. The labyrinth had a way of feeding on negative emotion until it festered into something monstrous. Their determination for escape propelled them forward. Occasionally, the flicker of their lights revealed half-submerged corridors, the water swirling with a foul odor. They tiptoed through, half expecting ghostly arms to snatch at their ankles. At times, they glimpsed silhouettes in the distance, moaning figures that evaporated the moment they approached. The walls seemed to close behind them, swallowing any route for retreat. Several hours later, or so it felt, they stumbled upon a low tunnel mouth exhaling a breath of fresh air. Brielle's spirits soared. They crawled through, ignoring the filth that clung to their clothes. Her heart lurched when she noticed the silver glow of the moon streaming through an iron grate overhead. The two of them forced it open, tasting freedom as a gust of cool air rushed in. They hoisted themselves upward, emerging onto a deserted back alley in the city. The moonlit sky felt impossibly wide and tranquil compared to the suffocating tunnels. Brielle collapsed onto the pavement, inhaling greedy lungfuls of the outside world. Aaron, trembling, sank down beside her. Under the soft glow of the street lamp, they exchanged glances filled with relief and the weight of too many horrors. Neither said a word for several minutes. Then, exhausted, they rose to their feet, and parted ways, with hesitant promises of recounting their experience to the authorities, yet they both knew no one would easily believe them. As Brielle trudged home, a pang of dread lodged in her stomach. She had escaped the labyrinth physically, but the experience clung to her mind like a stain. Every step up to her apartment felt as though she were carrying the asylum's presence. She locked her door, half expecting to find the monstrous figure in the shadows. The night passed in fitful slumber, haunted by swirling nightmares of screaming corridors and the solemn face of her ancestor. When morning finally arrived, she had no appetite. She paced the living room, fighting the urge to flee the city altogether. Instead, she gathered strength and resolved to return to the museum. She had to be sure the hatch was sealed, that no one else uncovered that place by accident. In the clarity of daylight, it seemed wise to bury what she had found, to protect the city from that malevolent domain. Her gut twisted with moral conflict. Should the place be exorcised or studied? She wasn't sure if either option could truly purge the labyrinth of its ghostly power. Brielle arrived at the museum to find an unsettling bustle. Police cars parked outside, uniformed officers speaking in urgent tones with security. She approached them cautiously. One officer recognized her museum badge and asked if she could identify a set of tunnels discovered in the basement. Horror coursed through her veins. Someone else had already found it. He explained that a security guard had disappeared overnight. They'd tracked him to a corridor in the basement where the hatch was wide open. Now the guard was missing, and the authorities were preparing to mount a search. She was racked with conflicting urges. To guide them in, to show them every corridor, or to insist they seal the hatch to prevent further tragedy. The labyrinth's living nightmare was not a place for rescue teams. Yet, how could she do nothing while a man's life potentially slipped into oblivion? While she wrestled with her conscience, an inspector arrived, imposing in his uniform. He began arranging search parties, ensuring they were well equipped with gas masks, high-powered lanterns, and communication devices. Brielle tried to explain what lurked down there. Illusions, voices, physical manifestations of regrets. The inspector listened politely, but with a pinch of skepticism. From his perspective, it was a standard missing persons case and a series of old tunnels. She wanted to set him straight, to tell him the city's regrets breathed in those corridors. But what words could make him believe? Without a better option, she joined the search party. At least she knew the labyrinth's layout, if that knowledge hadn't morphed overnight. Her fingers still shook as she tied on a headlamp and followed the others into the depths. She feared that the labyrinth had changed again to entrap new souls. Yet she also felt an odd sense of responsibility, as though it was her burden to take on. The group descended the stairs, stepping into the gloom, the clamor of their gear echoing loudly. The labyrinth seemed to rumble in anticipation, eager for new regrets to add to its collection. As Brielle led them deeper, she saw that the tunnels had indeed shifted. Corridors that previously led to dead ends now opened into new routes. She glimpsed fleeting shapes at the edge of her vision. Her headlamp cast long shadows that twisted in unnatural ways. Despite the heavy presence of the search party, a suffocating hush enveloped the group, as though the labyrinth was holding its breath. When they reached the wide chamber before Penrose Asylum's entrance, half the team gasped in astonishment. Others muttered curses under their breath. The structure rose like a malignant fortress, parted from the rest of the underground by an aura of savage dread. Brielle saw a policeman shining his flashlight along the barred windows, his mouth opening and closing in stunned silence. The inspector whispered, "What is this place?" Before Brielle could answer, she felt a subtle tug in her chest. The labyrinth recognized her presence. She was the one who had dared to escape. It wanted her to return, to relinquish the illusions that had fed off her regrets. A faint, moaning wind coursed through the corridors, and she understood with sinking clarity that the labyrinth wasn't just stone and metal. It was a living reflection of every torment the city had ever suppressed. She wanted to speak, to tell them all to turn back, but she found herself stepping forward, compelled toward those iron-barred doors. This time, though, she wasn't alone. Maybe if they all confronted their regrets together, the labyrinth's hold would weaken. But that fleeting hope warred with her dread. What if entering again only unleashed more horrors, fueling the labyrinth's power? A metallic groan echoed through the chamber as the asylum's doors seemed to shift. Her last rational thought was that the place was feeding on them, that each new regret brought deeper illusion. Her heart thundered as she reached for the handle, terrified yet knowing there was no turning back if she wanted to save the missing guard. The others stood behind her, uneasy shadows cast in the flickering light of their lanterns. She willed her hand to remain steady as she gripped the iron handle. The labyrinth pulsed around her like a living entity. In that trembling moment, she felt the presence of all the regrets scrawled into the walls, the city's secrets, sins, and unspoken sorrows. She remembered the monstrous figure she'd seen. She recalled the old patient files, the wailing corridors, her long-dead ancestor. But above all, she remembered the younger brother, whose funeral she had never properly processed. Tears of longing and remorse stung her eyes. She had come full circle to the labyrinth's epicenter, prepared to confront its dark heart or be consumed by it. Slowly, Brielle pushed the door open, the clang reverberating through her soul. The darkness beyond seemed to breathe in anticipation, and as she stepped over the threshold, she realized the labyrinth was challenging her. Dare to face your regrets, or remain forever in the shadows below. She closed her eyes, swallowed the dread, and stepped deeper inside, light and shadows twisting as the city's regrets gathered to greet her once again.